Camping, there's something about it that feels so primal, so freeing. Leaving behind the noise of the city, trading crowded streets for the quiet embrace of nature. But that same quiet, that same isolation, can quickly turn against you. In the middle of the woods, where no one can hear your cries for help, where the shadows stretch just a little too long, anything can happen. Tonight, I'll share 3 chilling tales from those who ventured too far into the wilderness, only to find themselves trapped in situations they couldn't explain and couldn't escape. These aren't just ghost stories. These are their confessions, retold in their own words. So if you think the forest is peaceful, if you feel safe surrounded by trees, you might want to think again. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of everyday life, a simple camping trip with friends. We'd chosen a remote spot deep in the woods, far enough from any trails to avoid crowds. The kind of place where you could hear nothing but the wind and the crackling of a campfire. No distractions, no phones, just nature. We set up camp in the late afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the trees in a warm, golden haze. The campfire pit was already there, dug deep into the earth, surrounded by weathered logs. We gathered wood and built a fire, the flames quickly licking the air as we settled in, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. It was peaceful, too peaceful, almost. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to come alive. The chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves was punctuated by distant, unsettling sounds, twigs snapping, footsteps that seemed just a little too close, but no one ever showed up. By the time the fire was reduced to glowing embers, we were all quiet, staring into the flames. That's when we heard it, the sound of something moving in the trees close to the edge of our campsite. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, like someone walking through the woods. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" My friend Mark, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. "It's just an animal. Probably a deer or something." But I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way the footsteps moved, slow and heavy, almost as if the thing was circling us. It was too deliberate to be random. We all sat there in tense silence for what felt like hours, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing happened. No one came, no animals appeared. The sounds faded away. The next morning, the unease was still there, gnawing at me. I tried to push it aside, thinking maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks. We went about our day, hiking through the woods and enjoying the view. The deeper we went, though, the more unsettled I became. It was as if the forest was watching us. The birds stopped singing, and the wind didn't move the leaves. It was unnaturally still. Around midday, we found a small creek and decided to stop for a break. As we sat along the banks, I noticed something strange, a series of footprints leading into the water. They were too large for a deer, too deep for a human. Something had stepped into the creek and walked through it, leaving behind muddy, claw-like impressions in the soft earth. "Those don't look like animal tracks," I said, pointing them out to the others. Mark dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Probably just some big animal. Bears, maybe." But something felt wrong. It was as if the woods themselves were becoming alive in a way that made me uncomfortable. That night, we sat around the campfire again, but this time, no one was laughing. The forest seemed darker than before, and the crackling of the fire seemed louder, like it was trying to drown out the growing sounds in the distance. We heard the footsteps again, circling us. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the trees. This time, no one said a word. We all just sat there, eyes wide, staring into the dark beyond the firelight. The rustling of the trees grew louder, and the air grew cold. The fire, which had been bright and fierce earlier, started to flicker, its light dimming as if something was draining it. That's when we saw it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing at the edge of the tree line. It wasn't quite human, But it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that moved in a jerky, unnatural way. Its head turned toward us, but we couldn't see its face. Only a pair of glowing, white eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness, staring directly at us. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My friends were too scared to move. We just sat there, frozen, as the thing slowly stepped back into the trees and disappeared, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. We didn't sleep that night. No one could. The footsteps never stopped, and the eyes never left us. The next morning, we packed up in silence, each of us afraid to speak of what had happened. We hurriedly gathered our things and left the campsite, eager to get back to civilization. But even as we walked out of the woods, the feeling of being watched never left. It followed us all the way to the car, and I'm sure none of us felt safe until we reached the nearest town. We never spoke of the camping trip again. I don't know if we imagined it, if the forest was playing tricks on us, or if something truly was out there. But I know one thing for sure, we were never meant to camp in that part of the woods. If you ever find yourself hiking near a remote campsite, and the forest feels too quiet, too still, just turn around and leave. Some things in the woods are better left undisturbed. If you've ever been deep in the woods, far enough that the trails disappear and the trees seem to close in around you, you'll know the kind of silence I'm talking about. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that hums in your ears and makes every snap of a twig feel like a gunshot. That's the kind of silence I found myself in last summer, and I haven't been able to shake it since. It started with a last-minute decision to join my friend Nate on a camping trip. He'd been planning it for weeks, but his girlfriend bailed on him at the last minute, and he didn't want to go alone. I wasn't much of a camper, but I figured a weekend in the woods might be a nice change of pace. Plus, Nate always promised me that he knew the best spots, places untouched by the usual crowds. We drove for hours, leaving behind paved roads for dirt paths that seemed to go on forever. By the time we arrived, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the towering pines. The air smelled clean and sharp, and the campsite Nate had chosen was picture perfect, right by a small, glassy lake with a rocky shoreline. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents and gathering firewood before the light faded. Nate was in his element, laughing and cracking jokes as he built the fire, but I couldn't shake a strange feeling in my gut. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the occasional breeze stirring the trees. "Relax," Nate said when I mentioned it. "That's the beauty of it. No noise, no people, no distractions. Just us and nature." I tried to take his advice, but as the night wore on, the quiet felt less like peace and more like something holding its breath. We sat by the fire, talking and laughing, until the flames burned low and we decided to turn in. Nate disappeared into his tent, snoring within minutes. I crawled into mine, zipped it up tight, and lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. The silence outside felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, and every little sound made my heart race. A faint rustling, a twig snapping, each one seemed louder than it should have been. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of whispers. Soft, almost inaudible, like a breeze passing through the trees, but there was a rhythm to it. Words I couldn't make out. I froze, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but still too garbled to understand. They weren't coming from the trees. They were closer, circling the campsite. My first thought was Nate, trying to mess with me. But when I called his name, there was no answer. Just the whispers, now coming from all around me. I unzipped the tent, my hands shaking, and peeked out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the campsite. Nate's tent was zipped shut, unmoving. Beyond the firelight, the woods were pitch black, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, no whispers, no movement, just that suffocating silence. Then, from the edge of the firelight, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the circle of light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, gangly limbs and a hunched posture. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes, two faint, glowing orbs, stared directly at me. I stumbled back into the tent, my heart racing. I zipped it shut, as if that thin layer of fabric would protect me, and clutched my flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers started again, louder this time, surrounding the tent. They weren't coming from one voice. It was many, overlapping and incoherent, like 1,000 people murmuring at once. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to those voices. Eventually, I worked up the courage to shine my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and empty ground. The whispers stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of the tent, desperate to see daylight. Nate was already up, poking at the embers of the fire. "You look like hell," he said, laughing. "Didn't sleep?" I wanted to tell him everything, but I didn't. I didn't want to sound crazy, and honestly, I wasn't even sure if it had been real. Maybe it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me in the dead of night. We packed up and hiked back to the car, leaving the campsite behind. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure standing in the distance. I never did, but the feeling didn't leave me until we were back on the road. A few weeks later, I couldn't stop myself from Googling the area we'd camped in. I came across an old forum post, buried in the depths of the internet. Someone else had camped there, years ago, and described hearing whispers in the night. They'd seen the same thing, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes. The post ended with a warning. "Don't camp near the lake. The forest isn't empty." I haven't been camping since. I swear I wasn't supposed to see it. None of us were. If we'd known what we were stumbling into, we never would have hiked that far off the trail. But curiosity, boredom, and bad luck led us straight into something I'll never forget. It started as a casual camping trip, me, my girlfriend Alyssa, and our mutual friends, Jake and Mia. We were all city kids looking for a weekend of nature, so we drove out to a state park that Jake swore had the best hidden spots. "Secluded," he said. "No noise, no people." He wasn't lying about that last part. We set up camp about 5 miles off the main trail, in a clearing surrounded by dense woods. The first night was uneventful, just marshmallows, bad ghost stories, and Jake scaring Alyssa by pretending to hear something moving in the bushes. Typical camping stuff. The second night was when everything changed. It started when Jake, full of whiskey and bravado, suggested we go for a night hike. Alyssa and Mia were hesitant, but Jake wouldn't shut up about how amazing the stars would look away from the campfire. Against our better judgment, we grabbed flashlights and headed into the woods. The first part of the hike was actually kind of nice. The trees towered above us, their branches forming a canopy that let only slivers of moonlight through. The air was cool and quiet, and for a while, it felt like we were the only people on Earth. But then, as we followed Jake deeper into the forest, we started hearing it. A low, rhythmic chanting, carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us. But as we moved closer, the sound grew clearer, voices, murmuring in unison. "Do you hear that?" Alyssa whispered, clutching my arm. "Probably just campers messing around," Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Out here? This far off the trail?" Mia countered, her flashlight shaking in her hand. We should have turned back then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but something about the chanting pulled us forward. It wasn't curiosity. It was like we were being drawn in, like the sound itself was calling to us. After about 10 minutes, we saw the light. Dim and flickering, like a fire, just beyond the trees. We killed our flashlights and crept closer, the chanting growing louder with every step. When we reached the edge of the clearing, I felt my stomach drop. There were at least a dozen of them, dressed in black robes with deep hoods that obscured their faces. They stood in a wide circle around the massive stone altar, carved with strange, jagged symbols that seemed to twist and writhe in the firelight. On the altar lay something covered by a white sheet, its outline vaguely human. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. One of the figures stepped forward, raising a long, curved blade into the air. The firelight glinted off its edge, and I realized it wasn't a ceremonial prop, it was sharp. Alyssa let out a small gasp, and I clamped my hand over her mouth, praying they hadn't heard us. The figure with the blade paused, tilting its head as if listening. I didn't breathe. None of us did. Then, slowly, it lowered the knife and gestured to the others. Two of them stepped forward, grabbing the sheet and pulling it back. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. The thing on the altar looked human at first glance, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, its torso too thin, and its skin was a pale, almost translucent gray. Its face, its face, was stretched and grotesque, with hollow, black pits where its eyes should have been. The chanting resumed, louder and more frantic this time, as the figure raised the knife again. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only watch, paralyzed, as the blade came down, plunging into the creature's chest. It let out a piercing scream, unlike anything I'd ever heard. High-pitched and inhuman, it echoed through the trees, making my ears ring. The robed figures didn't react. They just kept chanting, louder and faster, as if feeding off the sound. That's when Mia snapped. She screamed, bolting back toward the woods. The chanting stopped again, and every hooded head turned in our direction. "Run!" I whispered, grabbing Alyssa's hand. We sprinted after Mia, Jake close behind us, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear them following, branches snapping, heavy footsteps pounding the forest floor. They didn't yell or make a sound, but I could feel them getting closer. I don't know how long we ran. Time didn't feel real anymore, just the endless forest and the terror driving us forward. Eventually, we burst out onto a dirt road. A pair of headlights blinded us, and I realized it was a park ranger's truck. We screamed and waved our arms, begging him to stop. The ranger looked confused but let us pile into the truck. We tried to explain what we'd seen, but the words came out jumbled and frantic. He took us back to the ranger station, promising to investigate. The next morning, they found our campsite, but there was no sign of the clearing or the robed figures. The ranger told us we must have gotten lost and imagined the whole thing, but I know what we saw. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the chanting. Three stories, three warnings about the dangers of the wilderness. A shadow that moves where it shouldn't, an unseen stalker that won't let you escape, and a ritual no camper was ever meant to witness. These weren't just coincidences or bad luck. They were reminders of how little we understand about what's out there. The forest hides more than wildlife. It has its own rules, its own secrets, and sometimes it chooses not to let us leave. Thank you for listening to these chilling stories. If they made you think twice about your next camping trip, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like these. Until next time, stay safe, and maybe stick to the trails.